made it a little bit awkward at certain points. I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but sometimes I've had the experience of going to a brand new place, having to meet brand new people, and get used to a whole new set of relationships that I did not have any history with. And I'm kind of in a completely different realm of knowledge from those people. Has anybody ever had that experience? Mm-hmm. Like the experience right now for me?
Yeah.
Except for Linda's back there, so I know her. Those of us who've been in the ministry at some point have felt this probably more than a lot of people. But it used to be a common thing back in the day when a company would hire someone and they'd have to move across the country, right, to establish new relationships and kind of get a new cultural understanding of the people around you. I grew up here in upstate New York. I grew up in Ilion, which is about an hour west of here, about 20 minutes from Utica. And I was a pastor for a time in Massachusetts, and then my family and I moved across the country to Kansas. And then about 5 years ago or so, I moved back to a small town called St. Johnsville. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, even if you've just driven through it on Route 5. Small little town. My wife has some family there, and we moved back to be near her family. And it's funny because after 5 years, you'd think that I would know some people in the town, St. Johnsville, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. As I'm sure all of you are aware, small towns have generations upon generations of history, and oftentimes there are not a lot of public spaces where people gather outside of schools, at least in New York. And so there's this weird catch-22 I find myself in at times in St. Johnsville, which is, there's a lot of family gatherings, but you have to know the person to be invited to these family gatherings. But it seems to be that family gatherings is where people get to know each other. So it's kind of a little catch-22. So what I did this year I started coaching my daughter's under-12 soccer team. We actually have our last game this afternoon. Just to try to get to know people a little bit more, plus I love the sport, and my daughter loves to play, and I want to be involved. But it's been a little bit awkward at times, I have to say, because sometimes I'm out on that field, and the kids are playing, and we're losing, let's say, and I sort of feel like the parents' eyes are on me, like judging my performance. Right? And I don't really know if they are, but I can imagine some of the judgments that people have. And I don't want to imagine them, but I can imagine them. And sometimes, every once in a while, there is actually real conflict. There's been a couple points this year where it just happens in life. Like it happens in all walks of life, there's conflict, right? And this is one of the things that I struggled with, actually, to deal with in my own life is, I'm an adult who's developed a sense of right and wrong. I have 3 children, an 8, 10, and 12-year-old, and I've been married for over 20 years. So, you get this sense in your life where you've developed a sense of what is the right way to do things. And as a parent, you have to direct your kids in those right ways. But sometimes a lot of the senses of right and wrong that I've developed in my life are based on my faith and my desire to follow Jesus. And sometimes there's this feeling that even though I'm from upstate New York, I'm similar to a lot of people that I'm dealing with, there is still something distinctive that comes out at times. Even if I have a lot of the same values as the people in this town, because I did grow up in New York, and there's at times where there are conflicts between my desire to follow Jesus and to do what's right, and the culture that's around me in this little town. Let me give you an example. It sounds a little abstract, but I'll give you an example. So one of those baseline beliefs that I have comes from Jesus, which is when Jesus says in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, "Do not judge so that you may not be judged." This is one of those things that as Christians we hear this text a lot, and it is something that we try to live by, right? Well, one day, my wife and my 3 kids, we were at breakfast at a place near our house for breakfast. And it was during the week, it was mid-morning, and a lady came up to us and started talking to us. Now, she wondered if we homeschooled our kids, because we were there at like a Monday morning at like 10 o'clock, and we told her, yeah, we homeschool our kids. And she told me how impressed she was and how great it was we homeschool our kids, because kids these days, because the schools are terrible, because parents don't know how to raise their children. She said all these things to us. In one fell swoop, she identified us as the good ones, and these 3 groups, all the parents, all the school people, all the kids, as the bad ones. Now, this may seem like a small example, and of course, as a parent, you want to pat yourself on the back for how awesome you are. But as a follower of Jesus, I feel compelled to follow what Jesus teaches and try to live my life that way. So it is relatively important to me not to be judgy, right? Not to judge. And of course, this is a small, tiny example, but we can multiply this example all over the place in our world right now. I mean, take your pick. It feels like we live in a time where there's conflicts, a lot of conflicts with our faith, right? We no longer live in a culture where we can assume that people share our basic values. And for many years, we did in the U.S. But we no longer really live in that culture. And yet, Jesus still calls us to be disciples, and still calls us to follow his teachings. And, here's the big part, to continue to have relationships with people with whom we disagree. Now, I think that this is a place where we see this conflict between following Jesus and trying to live out our faith and still being with people we disagree about. I think this is one of those places where we see the genius of Jesus. Because in 2 conversations in our text in Matthew today, Jesus gives us a model for how to disagree with people and still have a relationship. And he does this in basically 2 different ways in these texts. The first way he does this is Jesus gives a positive vision for what Jesus' faith really is. And then, when he challenges people who disagree with them, he challenges them with a question. He gives a positive vision, and he challenges with a question. Now, a quick note for you, for everybody here to understand something a little bit about me. As a pastor, I was always very concerned with, when we read the Gospels, one of my basic concerns is that we don't see the Gospels just as some information about Jesus and information that you and I have to believe. When I read the Gospels, I read them as texts that show us how to be like Jesus, to imitate Jesus. In other words, these are texts about how to be disciples. And so when Jesus does something like this, he has this conversation, I take this as being, here's how to do it, folks. This is why Matthew put this in the Gospel. It's not just about, here's what I should believe about Jesus, but also how I should act like Jesus. So that's just a little aside, little caveat, just so you understand something about my assumptions here. Now, the 2 little conversations we see in our Gospel today happen in the context of disagreement. Jesus has come into the temple, or come into Jerusalem, and one of the places he goes very early on is the temple. And in that temple, there are a bunch of groups. There's elders, there's priests, there's Sadducees, there's Herodians. But the group that Jesus had the most in common with all these people were the Pharisees. And this is the group that he has this conversation with. And it's really important to understand this, though, that of all the Jewish groups, Jesus' outlook in theology and practice is actually the closest to the Pharisees of all these groups. The Pharisees, if you don't know who the Pharisees are, they were a group of people who wanted the faith in God to really be embraced by all people. Really be embraced fully, in other words, by the laity. They were a group that emerged in around 200 BC, and what they started to do was they started to teach the law to people and have them actually follow the law. And now that sounds weird for us, but if you actually look at the Old Testament, a lot of the laws are really concerned with priests, not so much laity. There's lots of other stuff about laity, but it's much more concerned with priests. And most people couldn't read. But one of the things that the Pharisees did was they were teachers. The word rabbi refers to a master of the Pharisees. And what they tried to do was to get the laws that were in the Old Testament actually effective in people's lives. So famously, one of the big things they did was they had meals together. And those meals, they kept kosher laws. And this was a place where people could practice following God in this particular way. So if you look at Jesus' ministry, of course, Jesus actually takes a lot of his ministry practice from the Pharisees. What is he called? He's called a rabbi, right? He's called a teacher. His disciples and him, they eat together. That was one of the basic things they did. You could actually look at, say, the Gospel of Luke. There are scholars who structure the Gospel of Luke, how it's broken up as eight different meals. So you can see that for Jesus, there's a lot of similarities between him and the Pharisees. And of course, one of the most important places where the Pharisees were active was in the area of Galilee. We often think of Galilee as kind of like a backwater, like Jesus was a peasant. But actually, it was the opposite. Judea was typically considered the backwater. Galilee was the end of the Silk Road. And if anybody knows about the Silk Road, this is a road that stretched from Galilee to Asia. And a lot of commerce through India and China, a lot of commerce happened there. So Galilee was actually a pretty cosmopolitan place. And the Pharisees taught people, lay people, students, kids, and it was one of the more educated areas of the ancient world because a lot of just normal people could read, which is not common in the ancient world. So Jesus, in other words, has quite a bit in common with these Pharisees. The Pharisees, for their part, at least the Pharisees we meet here, are suspicious of Jesus, though. Earlier in this scene in Matthew, Jesus tells a parable that angers the chief priests and the leaders of the Pharisees. Now, it's funny because the Pharisees did not necessarily get along with the other groups here, especially the Sadducees. And you can see in this text where they initially actually says that Jesus silenced the Sadducees, and the Pharisees wouldn't be sad about that. The Pharisees and Sadducees were very different. One of the bedrock beliefs of the Pharisees was in the resurrection of the body. And one of the bedrock beliefs of the Sadducees was against resurrection of the body. So you can see there's definitely differences here. But the Pharisees this silence kind of prompts the Pharisees to question Jesus sort of like in a test. Now, I don't really have an exact analogy for what the Pharisees are doing here, but I think of it something like this. In our town in St. Johnsville, we really recently hired a chief of police, a new chief of police. And there was a town meeting where the chief of police came and in front of the village board, and it was a public meeting, and anybody could ask the chief of this candidate questions. So I imagine this scene sort of like that. Jesus is sitting or standing, and there's a group of all these different groups, and the public is listening in, and they're kind of grilling Jesus. They're kind of like, it's like a candidate. Who are you for real? And while Jesus had earlier angered some of the Pharisees, it talks about the Pharisees actually gathering together in particular to actually try, this is kind of a very specific thing for me, but like when you're in an ordination interview as a pastor, one of the things that happens is that you get asked questions about your beliefs and about interpretation of various things. So I imagine this sort of like a pastor in an ordination exam, and they're trying to trip you up a little bit. They're trying to see if this controversial thing, what you'll say about it. So I imagine kind of like that's what the Pharisees are doing here. They're trying to say, what is Jesus going to say about this controversial thing? And what is the controversial thing? They ask Jesus, Rabbi, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Now, this was, among the Pharisees, a live debate. And the controversy wasn't about, in particular, which commandment was the greatest. The controversy actually was, do we treat the commandments as all of the same, all 638 exactly the same, or do we prioritize some commandments over others? This is a live debate because the Old Testament doesn't say one way or the other. I think of this sort of like the debates of baptism in Christian history. Should we baptize infants? Or should we wait till they can believe and choose on their own to baptize? Text could be read either way, right? So this is the test that they have for Jesus. And they're trying to find out, which side of this debate are you on, Jesus? And Jesus' answer here, he answers the two greatest commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, this is also not controversial for the Pharisees. In fact, there was a famous Pharisee who became sort of the father of modern Judaism, Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva one time was asked, he was about 100 years after Jesus, can you explain the entire law standing on one leg? That's what the question was. And he said to them, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. The rest is just commentary. That's what Rabbi Akiva said. So you see, this is not necessarily controversial, what Jesus is saying. There definitely would have been some Pharisees who would have been like, yeah, I agree with that. But the thing to me that's interesting is what Jesus says after that. He says, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. This here, in my view, is Jesus' positive vision of his faith. He's trying to say something about the interplay between love of God and love of neighbor. And this is something that you can see quite a bit in the Old Testament prophets, especially, where they talk about loving God with your whole heart, right? So it's not just empty religion. And I think the point Jesus is making is that loving God enables us to love our neighbor, and the proof that we do love God is that we do love our neighbor. And this fact, that love of God enables love of neighbor, and love of neighbor displays our love of God, is really foundational to Jesus' vision of faith. And you can see how this works itself out in so many different ways in the Gospels. From healings on the Sabbath, to who he invites for dinner. And in the next chapter, Jesus gets really direct with the Pharisees on some criticisms of the Pharisees. And a lot of his criticisms center around these two subjects, how one affects the other. And if you take a look at that, and you can kind of see that. All right, so that's the first solution to our problem. How do you disagree with someone? You offer a positive vision of faith. The second thing Jesus does in this passage is instead of directly challenging the Pharisees, he challenges them with a question. Jesus asks, what do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he? Their response, of course, Jesus anticipates, no doubt, because most Jews who believed in Messiah did believe that Messiah was the son of David. This is extremely normal. They believed that a descendant of David would be Messiah. But then Jesus asks them, he said to them, how is it that then David by the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. So what's going on here? Well, this is a quote from Psalm 110, which, if you didn't know, is the most quoted Old Testament scripture in the New Testament, by far. This verse is by far the most quoted. And this question really gets focused in on Jesus understood what the problem that the Pharisees, Sadducees, elders, the chief priests, and Herodians all had with Jesus. And that problem is that Jesus claimed to be Messiah. Now, it was a baseline belief that among Jews that Messiah would be descended from David. And Matthew and Luke, by the way, are at pains to show that Jesus did descend from David. Jesus is not saying here that that's not true. But by asking this question, Jesus is saying that the question of the Messiah isn't just about right parents or who's on the right team, or even who has the correct program for restoring Israel. Instead, Jesus is pointing to a limitation in their thinking about Messiah, that it's only a political program, that Messiah is only about restoring Israel alone. In other words, Jesus was asking this question because he knew of the disagreement about what Messiah would be like. And this shows a particular way Jesus talked about being the Messiah throughout his ministry. Over and over again, Jesus kind of exceeds the expectations of simply a political program to something deeper. Now, in this passage in particular, the Pharisees don't take up Jesus on this question, right? They don't answer him. There's something about this question that it's too much for them, and they can't figure it out, and nor do they want to answer them. But I do wonder, in this passage, it doesn't necessarily mean that none of the Pharisees were convinced, right? And you wonder to yourself, was one of the most famous Pharisees, St. Paul, was he in the crowd at this particular point? And did that have some kind of effect on him later on? But I really love these two conversations, and I really think it does help with the conflict we feel between the culture we're a part of and how we try to have faith in Jesus. And let me give you just a very small example of how these two things might work out itself in practice. And this is just a small example from my own life. So the company that I work for, that's my day job, has a sister site in Las Vegas, the same line of business as us. So we have managers who will go back and forth sometimes. We'll take a trip to Las Vegas. And if you don't know this, Las Vegas is a place in the U.S. where a lot of homeless people end up. They end up migrating to Vegas. It's kind of one of the places in the U.S. that it's warm most of the time, and people just kind of end up there. Who knows why? There's a lot of tourists there, so it might be a little bit easier to get a lot of hotels. It might be easier to get some provision for if someone's a homeless person. But whenever someone comes back from Vegas, in our lunches, I always hear this discussion, which is how disgusted people feel about the homeless in Vegas. How they smell and how annoying it is to have people ask for money. And that they just get a job. That's kind of the basic feeling among the people that are at that lunch table. And for me, this is another one of those conflicts. Jesus tells us to give to those who ask, without question. And generosity to the poor is fundamental to when it comes to Christian practice. It's actually one of these things that the Romans really hated about Christians, that they actually cared about the poor. And so Christian history is filled with instances of people like St. Basil, who founded hospitals because they were trying to care for the poor. In my own life, I've done homeless ministry in multiple cities, in Massachusetts and Kansas and New York. So this, for me, is one of those things. It was so surprising to hear the contempt in people's voices, because for me growing up, this was something that you just understood. You cared for the poor. So how would you engage with someone who you disagreed with on this particular point? I had a conversation with someone about this, and one of the things that I tried to express to them, I'm not sure how great I did this, was that generosity is essential to me. It's in my faith. And the foundation of all creation, the foundation of all life, is God's generous gift to us. One of the things that is so important about understanding that God created all things is that God did not have to create us. God created because God was giving something. And so creation is really giving all the way down. Therefore, when someone asks us for money, this is an opportunity for us to imitate God. Imitate the basic thing about God, God's beneficence to us. And then I ask the person, well, if we're not going to give money, what is the responsibility that we have toward these people? What if this person never had anyone in their life who taught them to provide for themselves? What if this person could not provide for themselves, either mentally or for some other reason? Now, I didn't convince that person anything. And oftentimes, honestly, this disagreeing with someone, telling them your vision, asking them a question will not convince people. And that's not really our job necessarily. But disagreement has always been a feature of Christian life. And we may feel it more keenly right now, but I assure you, it's not more keen than it has been in the past. It is not more difficult now than it has been in the past. Christians have always had to live with a different standard because Jesus calls us to something that's pretty difficult, that oftentimes really goes against the grain of what we normally would want to do. Now, that lady in the coffee shop, what I did say to her is, I said to her, I'm not sure. Could it be that one of the things that God calls us to is that we parents should send our kids to these schools? That we parents who are followers of Jesus should send our kids to be salt and light? Send our kids to befriend those kids who don't have parents who give them as good of guidance? I just said that to the lady. The conversation ended, and the next time we went, she didn't talk to me again. But we all are going to have points of disagreements based on our faith. And Jesus here gives a really good example. He did have a lot of agreement with those groups, and yet he showed them a different vision of faith. And who knows what those questions actually bore, the fruit that it bore for Jesus. But we do know is that this is a compelling vision for our faith, and it's something that I think, as Christians, we should all attempt to do with those who we disagree with but want to maintain a relationship. Amen.
Amen.